In this tutorial, we'll start from the React Kanban project from the last video. There's a link in the description, and we're going to add Redux. So we're going to start out by doing yarn add Redux, and that's going to add Redux to our project. And then we're going to add React Redux. So if we pull up the Redux documentation here and click under Recipes and Configuring your store, we'll see the example of how to set up your store. So you import provider and you import create store from React Redux and Redux. So go ahead and do that here. We'll import provider and we'll import create store. You'll also see it imports the root reducer. So we'll go ahead and import that here. Import root reducer. That doesn't exist yet, but we'll create that. So we'll touch reducers.js and we'll open that up in our editor. And this actually belongs in index.js. So we'll go ahead and move this over here to index.js. And we'll go ahead and do const store equals create store. And we'll pass in the root reducer there. And then in our render method here, we need to wrap the app in the provider component, pass in the store prop. That's going to make Redux available via the context API in React. So we go ahead and wrap the app in the provider there in our entry point, index.js. We'll start back up Webpack Dev Server here with yarn start. And when that starts up, we'll go ahead and reload our app. And it looks like we got an error here. So we need to go ahead and create the root reducer. So let's do that now. We're going to export default function, and reducer takes in state as the first argument, it's default to an empty object, and the action is the second argument. And we're just going to start out by returning the state, and the app is back to a working state. Now let's go ahead and create some actions. So we're going to create actions.js. You don't have to do this, but it's a best practice to create some constants in a separate file and use those constants instead of kind of hard coding those strings throughout your app. So our actions are going to be add, and we're going to have move. And let's go ahead and create another action for loading the data. And we're going to need the Redux DevTools extension. So we'll add yarn add Redux DevTools extension. And we'll import compose with DevTools. And we'll go ahead and pass that in our create store. It basically creates a middleware that hooks up to Redux DevTools, provides time travel debugging. So we'll just kind of add this boilerplate here from the Redux DevTools documentation. And if we reload over here, go to our Redux DevTools, which I've installed in Chrome, and make sure Webpack Dev Server is running, of course. And then reload our app. We should see the Redux DevTools is working. So let's go ahead and create some logic here in our reducers. So first thing we need is our initial state. That's going to be the load action. So I forgot to add that. Let's add the load action here. And then we're going to handle it with a switch. We're going to switch on the action.type. We're going to handle a load action. So whenever a load action is dispatched, we're going to hit a case statement in here. So we're going to import our actions as actions from actions. And then we could do action.add, action.move, action.load, reference those constants. So we'll add a case statement here for action.add, move, and load. Now let's go ahead and implement the load case. So the load case needs to load the initial state here. We'll just go ahead and hard code that in here. And we're going to return the initial state. and that works. So we no longer need the constructor here in the app. Instead, we're going to dispatch the load action on component.didMount. So we're going to implement it with an arrow function and call this .props.load. Now we need to wire that up to our Redux store. So we're going to import connect from React Redux. And that's a higher order component, so it wraps our app component. It's going to take two functions, map state to props and map dispatch to props. Those aren't functions I made up, it's part of React Redux. And that's called currying, so we call a function, returns a new function, then we call a function on that. So we're going to implement map state to props and map dispatch to props now. I'm going to use arrow functions, but you could use regular functions if you'd like. So what that's going to do is take our Redux state and map pieces of that state to the props of this connected component, app.js. So we want to take the columns in off the state. That's what we're passing in on the args, and then we're going to map it in as the props called as a prop called columns. And then on map dispatch to props, we're going to define three props: add, move, and load. And we're going to just dispatch those actions in line here. You should look into bind action creators if you're working on a larger app, but we'll just handle it this way and move on. And so each of those is a key that needs to call a, or needs to have a value of a function, so we need to wrap these in arrow functions here. And then we're going to take in any arguments that need to get copied onto that action. So in this case, to do a move, we need to know the column index, card index, and direction. So we're going to take that in and pass that on to the action, or serialize that into our action. Basically, just copy it in. And likewise, on our add and load, we need to wrap those in arrow functions as well. Add takes in the column index. And we need to import those actions up here. So we'll go ahead and import, add, move, and load from actions. And it looks like we are still getting another error here. So this .state.columns is now this .props.columns. It's coming in through the props because the connected component selects it off of Redux and off of our Redux state, maps it into a prop, passes it in as a prop. It's no longer in the internal state of this component. So let's see, we're getting another error here. So let's go to the Redux DevTools. So we can see when we called load, it created the initial state, but this render actually got called before that load and then crashed, and we didn't really handle that, so the app is still crashed even when the state comes in. So we'll go ahead and put a guard here. If the columns aren't there, return, and return nothing from render. We need to return null. And we need to wrap the load function in an arrow function as well. That's what this error here is referring to. So this .props.load is not a function because we actually called dispatch and then assigned the return value to the prop. We need a function. And we're back to a working state once we wrap that in an arrow function. So if we go over back to the Redux DevTools, we can see initialized, loaded, state got populated, and then the app re-rendered. Great. So now let's go ahead and move the handle add and handle move business logic into the Redux store, into our reducers. So add actually needs to take in the card in addition to the column index. We need the card that we're adding to that column that's pointed to by the column index. And on what we call the function, we're going to pass in the index. So we'll just move that business logic here into this case statement. And we're going to go ahead and grab the columns off of the state. And right now this mutates the state, but we want to return a new state. So how are we going to do that? Well, we're just going to return a new object, and then we can do some kind of despreading in here. So let's start with despreading the columns in there, just to start and kind of see how this all fits together. So we're going to make a copy of the columns. I know we can use .slice to make a copy of an array, or we could use destructuring. I'll start with .slice here. So make a copy of columns and push the card on there. And where's the card going to come from? Well, we can pluck that off of the action or destructure that off of the action. So we got our card off of the action.card, push that onto the copy of the columns, and then return a new state with the new columns. And it looks like we need to grab the column index off of that action as well. And let's see, okay, so that adds a card, but there's a problem here. So you may not spot the problem yet, but you'll see soon. So let's continue moving over this move logic. Alright, so we got our move logic moved over here. And let's go ahead and do the same kind of thing where we make a copy of the columns. So we don't want to mutate that state, we want to return a new state. So we'll destructure the existing state and add on the copy of columns. And just like with the add, we need to grab the column index and card index and direction off of the action. Direction. And duplicate entry card. So because of the way scoping works, we need to block scope this. So I'll wrap this in a block here, curly braces. And that makes sure each case handler has its own scope, its own block scope. And we're getting an error here because we still have the this dot set state calls. So let's call the Redux dispatches. So we're going to get rid of handle move, and we're just going to call this .props.move. Accepts the same arguments as before. And then add, we're going to actually wrap it because we don't want window prompt in our Redux store. So when I jump here, you see it does not time travel. We're stuck on the last state. So I mentioned we had a problem. So generally when it doesn't jump, that means you've mutated the state accidentally. And since we're dealing with nested state, a common mistake is we'll clone the parent array but not the subarray. So let's try to fix that by cloning the subarray here. So we're going to call .slice on each column. And that didn't work. So it's actually on the column. Once we index into the columns array and get the column, it's actually at .cards. So it's .cards.slice. So let's try that. So we're going to make a copy of the cards. And I don't think this is going to work because we're still mutating the column object here. So when we time travel here, it's still stuck. It's not jumping around like it should be. Or time travel debugging is not working, which is one of the huge benefits of using Redux. So a library that helps here is deep freeze. It'll deep freeze your state, and then if you try to accidentally mutate it, it'll throw an error and it'll pinpoint exactly which line that failed on. So one thing we could try is we could try adding deep freeze. So go ahead and take this slice calls out of here. And before we do that, this slice call here, we can actually use destructuring just to make that a little bit more readable. So let's go ahead and take these slice calls out of here. So columns equals, and then we'll just despread the columns instead of doing column slice. I just find that a little bit more readable. It's the kind of newer way to do that. So that just clones the columns or makes a copy of the columns that we can then mutate because it's a new state. And we're going to do cards and make a copy of the cards as well. And for both the source and the destination column, we'll make a copy of the cards. And let's go ahead and comment this up like we said. So we're going to clone the source and destination subarrays. So in addition to cloning the columns, the array of columns, we need to also clone the array of cards in each column. When you clone the parent array, you're just copying the existing reference to the subarrays, and then you're mutating that. And Redux can't time travel because we've changed the state, lost track of the old state. So we're going to clone the source and destination subarrays, splice out of the source subarray, and push the card back into the destination subarray, and then return the new state with the new columns. And we see this does not work with the time travel debugging still. So we're still mutating something. And this is getting a little bit hard to follow even with our comments and our syntactic sugar using the object spread syntax and array spread syntax. It's still a little bit hard to follow. I can't spot the bug offhand. So a library I mentioned that can help with this is deep freeze. So we'll go ahead and search for that here, and no, we're not freezing stuff. We're using deep freeze npm, and let's go ahead and add that with yarn add deep freeze. Great, so that's in the package. So let's import it here. Import deep freeze. Let's see how they do it here. Deep freeze from deep dash freeze. And then we use that by just calling deep freeze on our state here. This is a good thing to do in your unit tests or just when manually debugging like this. We'll start this back up and reload our app. And now when we try to mutate, we get the error instead of it silently mutating. Great. So cannot assign to read-only property cards. So let's break this out here. We actually want to make a copy of the column object where we create a new cards array that's a copy of the previous cards array. So we'll despread the existing column into this new object literal, and then create a cards property, and then create a new array where we despread the previous cards in there. So we can move things around here, and if we go look in the Redux Dev Tools and jump, now we do have time travel debugging because we fixed all of our mutations, and that was way easier to debug using deep freeze. I highly recommend that library when you're developing in Redux or any kind of mutable paradigm. And let's go ahead and solve the same problem here in the actions.add switch case. We need to kind of basically solve the same problem here. So let's use the same solution. So the cards is going to be a new array where we spread in the previous cards and then add the new card. So that's like doing array.push, except we're doing it immutably. We're creating a new array where we despread in all the elements of the old array and then finally put a new card at the end. So if we test here and jump around, we can see we can time travel debug, but the add didn't seem to undo. So looks like we still have a bug in here. We could use deep freeze again, but I think I see the bug. So the column needs to be a new object with a new cards array, and we just lost the title. Why is that? Well, this new object we created on line 46 only has a cards property. We lost the name, so let's despread in the existing column there. We could just copy in the name, but we'll kind of despread any and all properties, so it'll future-proof it for when we add new fields going forward. And now we can jump around and we can see time travel debugging appears to be working for all of the different actions, and we can kind of test this around a little bit, move cards around and jump around in our history. Thank you for watching my nested state Redux tutorial.